In the first minutes after 1:23 inches the morning on the 26th of April 1986, there was no sound of alarm. The explosion that had just torn through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant produced a boom that echoed across the pine forests of northern Ukraine. But inside the control room, the immediate aftermath was marked by something far more unsettling than noise. It was marked by silence. The kind of silence that follows when machinery that has hummed for years suddenly stops, when indicator lights that should be glowing steady go dark, when men who have trained for every conceivable emergency find themselves staring at readings that make no physical sense. The air tasted metallic. A fine dust hung in corridors that moments before had been sterile. Somewhere beyond the reinforced walls, a fire was burning, a strange fire unlike anything these engineers had ever seen. The graphite core of the reactor was now exposed to the open sky, releasing invisible particles into the cool spring night. No one in that control room knew yet what they were breathing. No one understood that the floor beneath their feet was beginning to conduct a kind of poison that would alter their cells within hours. They only knew that something catastrophic had occurred, and that they were expected to respond. This is the nature of survival at Chernobyl. It was never a single decision, never a clear moment of heroism or failure. It was a cascade of choices made by ordinary men and women who possessed incomplete information, outdated equipment, and a profound loyalty to a system that offered them no adequate preparation for what they now faced. To understand why these decisions were made, one must first abandon the comfort of hindsight. The operators of Reactor 4 were conducting a safety test that night, designed to determine whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough power during a blackout to keep coolant pumps running. Due to scheduling conflicts and bureaucratic pressure, the test had been delayed and restarted under conditions that pushed the reactor into an unstable state. When Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov ordered the test to proceed despite falling power levels, he was operating within a culture that prioritized results and trusted implicitly in Soviet engineering. The RBMK reactor design had vulnerabilities that were not fully disclosed to the operators. The men pressing buttons that night did not know that their reactor could, under specific conditions, become exponentially unstable within seconds. They made their decisions based on what they believed to be true, and what they believed was wrong. In the immediate aftermath, firefighters from Pripyat arrived within minutes. These men climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall, where chunks of graphite from the reactor core lay scattered like ordinary debris. They kicked these fragments aside with their boots. They worked through the night without respirators, without dosimeters, without any understanding of the radiation levels surrounding them. The firefighters of Pripyat were trained for industrial accidents. They had no frame of reference for a nuclear core breach. Such an event was, according to official doctrine, essentially impossible. The men who climbed those ladders were not ignoring danger. They were unaware of its true nature. Within hours, many would begin to vomit. Within days, some would be dead. Inside the plant, engineers faced the impossible task of assessing damage to a reactor that no longer existed in its original form. Early radiation readings were dismissed as instrument malfunctions because the dosimeters available simply maxed out. Some workers approached areas where radiation levels were so intense that exposure for even a few minutes would prove fatal. Valery Kodemchuk, a pump operator, was never found. His body remains entombed within the wreckage. His colleague, Vladimir Shashanok, was discovered unconscious, his skin already showing radiation burns. These men had no chance to make survival decisions. The explosion made those decisions for them. But for others, the choices were agonizing. Plant workers were asked to return to areas of high contamination to shut down systems and gather information. Each trip carried a biological cost that would not become apparent for weeks. The men who agreed often did so out of duty to their colleagues, to their plant, to a society that trained them
Are you
to
going
place
to the dacha
collective
this weekend?
welfare above
I hope
personal
so,
safety.
if the weather holds up.
As dawn broke over Pripyat, residents began their Saturday routines. Children played outside. The explosion had been visible from some windows, but official reassurances had begun circulating. Everything was under control, the authorities said. The decision to delay evacuation emerged from a system that prized stability and feared panic. Soviet officials had limited experience with radiological disasters. The threat was invisible, and invisibility bred denial. 36 hours after the explosion, the evacuation finally began. Over 50,000 people were told to pack enough belongings for 3 days. They would never return. By the time the evacuation order was issued, the most intense period of fallout had already passed over Pripyat. The residents who had trusted their government had absorbed doses that would later manifest as elevated cancer rates and thyroid disorders. In the weeks that followed, hundreds of thousands of workers, known as liquidators, were conscripted to clean up the contamination. They came from across the Soviet republics, soldiers, miners, students. They were given minimal protective equipment. Some were assigned to clear graphite from the roof of Reactor 3. The radiation levels were so extreme that each worker could only spend 90 seconds in the exposure zone. They called themselves bio-robots because the actual robots had failed, their circuits fried by radiation. These men ran onto the roof, shoveled debris, and ran back. Some exceeded their limits because there was no one else, because refusing would mark them as cowards. Were they heroes? Were they victims? The distinction collapses when examined closely. They were human beings caught in circumstances that demanded impossible trade-offs. The long-term consequences extended far beyond the immediate death toll. Medical researchers documented elevated thyroid cancer rates among children exposed to radioactive iodine. The psychological toll was equally significant. Entire communities lived with the knowledge that their bodies contained invisible contamination, that their futures had been compromised by decisions they had no part in making. The concept of the Chernobyl necklace, a scar from thyroid surgery, became a grim marker of shared experience. Survivors formed bonds based on a common history that outsiders could never fully understand. For evacuees, the question of return became its own prolonged ordeal. Some families were resettled and told to begin again. The exclusion zone became permanent. Within it, nature began its own reclamation. Forests grew back, wildlife returned, and Pripyat became a monument to absence. A small number of elderly residents chose to return despite prohibitions. They had lived through famines, Nazi occupation, collectivization. Radiation was simply another threat to endure. Most outlived predictions, dying of old age rather than radiation illness. Their survival complicated the official narrative. The story of Chernobyl is not about good decisions and bad decisions. It is about decisions made under conditions that made good outcomes nearly impossible. The operators did not know the physics that would betray them.
Yes, I see it.
The firefighters did not know the graphite at their feet was killing them. The officials did not know how quickly contamination was spreading. At every level, decisions were shaped by incomplete information, institutional pressure, and the human tendency to believe that the worst will not happen. What Chernobyl teaches is not a lesson about nuclear power alone. It reveals the gap between what we think we know and what we actually understand. It shows how trust in systems can become a liability when those systems fail to account for their own limitations. The sarcophagus enclosing Reactor 4 is itself a decision made under uncertainty. The radioactive material inside will remain dangerous for thousands of years, far longer than any human institution has endured. Future generations will inherit the responsibility of maintaining barriers our generation cannot guarantee. In the quiet of the exclusion zone, where Geiger counters still click and abandoned buildings crumble, the decisions of 1,986 continue to echo. They echo in the bodies of survivors, in the grief of families, in the question that every disaster eventually poses. What would I have done, knowing only what they knew? There is no satisfying answer. There is only the recognition that survival is never a solitary act. It is woven into the choices of strangers, the failures of institutions, the invisible forces that shape our world. The men and women of Chernobyl made their decisions in the dark, against dangers they could not see. And history, with all its terrible clarity, has never stopped judging them, even as it refuses to offer any certainty that we would have chosen differently.